Good Monday. This is Jay Brew, co-chairman of Seafried and Brew. This is the second part of our webcast talking about shocks, and we've talked about it from the standpoint of how shocks have really been a regulatory concern in here, looking at those instantaneous shocks, and from the standpoint of a management and board concern, because in my mind what it's doing is it's causing decision making which can negatively impact earnings. And that's why we want to think about in a better way how we look at shocks from the standpoint of risk. And that we need to be able to put into our policies. So when we look at policies, for instance, is that a lot of banks in their policies go on those plus 300, plus 400 basis point shocks and put in what they look at in terms of guidelines. Well, if you just stop there and the regulators come in and say you're out of your guidelines, that in effect what you've just done is to come under criticism. The big piece of this is to really sit there and say that these are red flags when we look at shocks. But as part of our policies, what we need to do is to say we go beyond this. We do more analysis that's more dynamic than simply instantaneous shocks. And that's the key to being able to use that dynamic type asset liability model to really look at what the interest rate risk, the capital risk, the liquidity risk is if interest rates start to rise. Do they rise instantaneously? Well, we see what the red flags are. But the thing is that there's much more going on in a community bank's balance sheet and income statement as interest rates change. For instance, one of the things that we've talked about is when we look at loan portfolio durations in here, is what we've seen is a shortening in community bank loan portfolio durations. So over the next year, that duration will most likely, for most of the community banks, growing loans at a fairly slow rate, will continue to come down, which has an impact in terms of those instantaneous shocks because you're looking at a loan portfolio shortening, and that of course reduces the risk as rates go up. So when we look at the model, is that we want to take this out over a 1-year time frame. And we want to even take it out over a 2-year time frame. So that what happens if interest rates start to go up, what is the effect of all of those cash flows taking place? Another piece that you'd like to put into that model is growth, because the regulators want to see a flat balance sheet. Well, yes, they want to see that, but from a management standpoint, we're more dynamic. We're going to have a certain amount of growth. Another piece that we talked about last week is that you want to make sure that all of this is tax affected. The majority of models that we're seeing out there do not tax affect that overall change in economic value of equity, which tends on the negative side and the higher interest rate side tends to overestimate what the impact of economic value is. So what can we do in terms of looking at different interest rate environments in here within our model to move away from managing to instantaneous shocks to managing more to what we consider a reality? So when we look at that, is that one thing you could do is to put a ramp, which we've been doing at Seafried and Brew, which is a ramp of up 300 basis points over a 1-year time frame. This has a huge impact in terms of the effect to Eve in a rising rate environment and makes it much more realistic of looking at that in that light. To move towards the regulator side of things, what you might also want to do is do a up 400 basis point ramp and to have that over a year. The other thing you could do is extend that out and do those 2 ramps over a 2-year period of time. and say that this is a much more realistic way of looking at change in interest rates. And I think, being a bank director myself, that this really gives you a much better sense of what could actually happen if interest rates go up. Because what I've contended in here is that low interest rates, and the national benchmark points this out in terms of their overall earnings, is not good for community banks in terms of their performance. We actually would love to see interest rates go up. But so many people are being caught into these instantaneous shocks that we need to look at this in a much more realistic way. To have the models that will sit there and really project out what a most likely case of interest rates going up, what kind of impact does it have on our earnings, liquidity, and capital, and then to make appropriate decisions around that. And if you're just simply doing those instantaneous shocks, is that it may not be giving a clear picture in terms of the performance of your bank, but it's really falling into the hands of the regulators. This is Jay Brew, co-chairman of Seafried & Brew. Have a great week.